I just invite you to stop me at any time during that and say, hey, what's that, or I see this, or whatever. I think the great thing about slides is that we all sort of adopt the perspective of the audience and become more equal than usual in these kind of presentations. So please, feel free to stop me. And then, of course, at the end, we'll speak, and I'll leave a lot of time for discussion, and we can run back through any slides that you want to revisit. Okay? So once again, thanks so much for showing up today. Before I set out on the tour, I said I want to start with contemporary developments there. But before I do that, and lest it gets lost in the details, I want to just state quickly the overall argument of the book and my overall argument about Guantanamo. And it's that our presence at Guantanamo and recent use of the naval base as a prison is not a regrettable anomaly on the war on terror, a departure from a long tradition of promoting self-determination and upholding the rule of law. There is some of that in U.S. history, but there is plenty else. Rather, Guantanamo was essential to the expansion of what Thomas Jefferson called this empire of liberty. Guantanamo is a product of the nation's liberal political economy, with its universal political and moral aspirations on the one hand, and its unslakable appetite for land, labor, resources, and markets on the other. Navy folks like to think of Guantanamo, the Guantanamo prison, which, sorry, I'll see if I can get some distance from it, is down here, if you can see this. I have a pointer that I'll use. This is the old base that's been there for 100 years. This is the Guantanamo prison that we know, that brings us here today. Navy folks like to think of this part as the good Guantanamo, and this part as the bad Guantanamo, leaving you and I to sort of scratch our heads and try to determine the connection. But the prison wouldn't be there without the Navy. And the Navy wouldn't be there without the U.S. government's decision, as we'll see, to retain the bay at the end of the Spanish-American War. Finally, none of this would be there today without the tacit consent of the American people, whose standard of living the U.S. government is sworn to protect. So I like to think that we're all involved here, not just bad conservatives versus good liberals, but that we all have responsibility for the Navy base and for its still being for the prison still being open today. Up close, a chasm seems to separate Bush administration officials, who apparently for the first time in history tried to write torture into law, from those of us who reject torture unconditionally. But through the lens of history, I insist, the differences blur, and Americans become one people, and Guantanamo becomes one bay. So I don't want to think that we are not involved in this. So what's up at Guantanamo right now? A couple highlights. Last June, at the height of the Guantanamo hunger strike, and I'll return to that very briefly, President Obama, having once shuttered the State Department office committed to closing the detention facility, pledged to redouble his efforts and to open a new Defense Department office dedicated to finally finishing the prison off. 100 days after this announcement, that office remains without a leader. This past August, 2 detainees cleared long ago of terrorism charges were repatriated to Algeria, leaving the current roster at 164. This too after Obama had told us that he was going to redouble his efforts to empty the prison of the innocent. So 2 have recently been repatriated, but that leaves 164. The Guantanamo hunger strike, which accelerated last March and peaked in late June, early July at 106 strikers, 3 of whom were hospitalized and 45 or so who were being force-fed, has diminished as of a few days ago to 22 or so. 20 of them now with feeding tubes. So something's happened so that the strike has by and large been broken. Late last year, the U.S. Southern Command requested some $200 million to keep the detention facility up to date, including $49 million to build a new special prison, as they put it, for the so-called high-value detainees. This on top of $40 million now being spent to install a new internet cable between Guantanamo and Key West. Guantanamo officials just announced this month, after months of pretrial motions and counter-motions, that the first military commission to formally open on President Obama's watch will begin a little over a year from now, next October. The defendant on trial is Abu al-Rahim al-Nashri, the alleged mastermind of the October 2000 attack on the USS Cole that left 17 American soldiers dead. A capital offense. Should the Guantanamo Military Commission find al-Nashri guilty, the president will find himself in the awkward position of presiding over the first military execution there. One can only imagine the headlines emblazoned across media around the world. Guantanamo execution, President Obama puts to death a detainee that the U.S. tortured. I'll come back to that. Finally, last December, for the third year running, Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act, its annual military appropriation. Among other things, this piece of legislation denies the president funding to shutter Guantanamo by transferring and prosecuting detainees stateside and repatriating those cleared to return home. Democrats led on this, by the way, after losing their majority in the 2010 midterm election. As in previous years, the president's response to this legislative blackmail was half-hearted. The administration strongly opposes the congressional meddling at Guantanamo, the Office of Management and Budget intoned. By contrast, the Republican defense of Guantanamo was robust. When you're fighting a war, Senator Lindsey Graham told an empty Senate chamber, the goal is not to prosecute people, the goal is to win. How do you win a war? You kill them, you capture them, and you interrogate them to find out what they're up to next. Simply stated, Graham continued, the American people don't want to close Guantanamo Bay, which is an isolated military-controlled facility. To bring these crazy bastards that want to kill us all to the United States would be insane. Most Americans believe that the people at Guantanamo, still Graham quoted, are not some kind of burglar or bank robber. They're bent on our destruction. So how in the world has this come to pass? How is it possible in late 2012 for Senator Graham to utter with a straight face the disinformation that the Guantanamo detainees are bent on our destruction, and for him to claim that Guantanamo is essential to the nation's safety, when the vast majority have been declared innocent of terrorism charges? How is it possible for legal officials at Guantanamo to still be debating whether the Constitution applies there, as the New York Times and Miami Herald consistently report? For the producers of Zero Dark 30 to suggest that Osama bin Laden would still be at large, but for the CIA's clear-eyed readiness to commit torture. For the nation to have become a mere hair's breadth away in the 2012 presidential election from returning the likes of Stephen Bradbury and Cully Stimson to top national security posts. And for Obama to face the prospect of presiding over the execution at Guantanamo of a detainee that the United States tortured. Clearly, much of the responsibility belongs to the Bush administration. Witness the case of al-Nashri, for example, who is no ordinary defendant. Captured in the United Arab Emirates in 2002, he was transferred to CIA custody and then taken to black sites in Afghanistan and Poland, where he was waterboarded, threatened with an electric drill and mock execution, and warned that his family would suffer the same fate if he did not tell interrogators what they wanted to hear. After arriving at Guantanamo in 2006, al-Nashri retracted a confession given under torture about his leadership of the Cole attack. The strongest evidence against him now appears to consist of second-hand hearsay, inadmissible in federal court, by the way. Salim Hamdan, the convicted driver of Osama bin Laden, told an FBI agent that he'd overheard al-Nashri boasting of planning the Cole bombing while visiting an al-Qaeda safe house in Afghanistan back in April 2001. The degree of coercion that produced that confession information is anybody's guess. Some of the responsibility rests with Congress, determined to maintain and exploit the fear that led the American public to turn a blind eye on Bush administration war crimes. Conservatives in Congress have managed to convince hitherto rational individuals like New York City's mayor that trying to accuse terrorists in federal court would be too dangerous, too costly, and too lenient, notwithstanding the record of successful federal terrorism prosecutions and the fact that sentences in such cases have tended to be far more severe than those meted out in military commissions. In the case exemplifying the supposed inability of the federal court system to handle such cases, Ahmed Galani, the alleged planner of the 1998 East Africa embassy attack, was given a life sentence, while Salim Hamdan tried at the last military commission before President Obama shut the system down, was given 5 months in addition to time already served. And the charges on which the two were convicted were identical: material support for terrorism or conspiracy. Indeed, the longest sentence handed down at Guantanamo is 9 months to Australian David Hicks. As cowed now as they were in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, congressional Democrats are only too happy to play along. It was a democratically led Congress, as I've suggested, who in December 2010 first exploited the power of the purse to deny Obama what he wanted to do at Guantanamo, that is, bring the detainees here and try them in federal courts. In continuing to deny Obama such funding, congressional Republicans then are only following the Democrats' lead. But surely much of the responsibility rests with the president himself. In August 2007, candidate Obama told the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars that as president he would jettison the Guantanamo commissions. As a venue for trying terrorists, he observed, Guantanamo was a perfect failure. Mr. Obama vowed to, quote, close Guantanamo, reject the Military Commissions Act, adhere to the Geneva Conventions, thus demonstrating to all the world that law is not subject to the whims of stubborn rulers and that justice is not arbitrary, end quote. Now, of course, election campaigns are aspirational and the challenges confronting presidents real and practical. Still, Mr. Obama insists that a series of reforms carried out after he took office have put the Guantanamo commissions on a par with federal courts and military courts martial in terms of constitutional safeguards. Logic alone refutes him. If the standards are equal, why do we need both? Moreover, military tribunals have historically been the object of last resort rather than political convenience. The al-Nashri case, to my mind, exudes the whiff of administration cherry-picking the venue most likely to produce its favored outcome, hardly evidence of a judicial system depoliticized. Furthermore, by allowing for appellate review, while at the same time admitting hearsay evidence and ignoring the Sixth Amendment safeguard of confrontation, among many other defects, the revamped commissions virtually guarantee that guilty verdicts will be mired in protracted review. In short, candidate Obama got it right. The Guantanamo commissions are unjust and unnecessary, hardly the path to swift justice the president claims that he wants. But Mr. Obama bears responsibility for the position in which he finds himself in another sense. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, the philosopher George Santayana remarked. I don't think that history repeats itself, but there is ample evidence of it haunting those who ignore it. Why has Obama failed to deliver on the promise to close the prison? The president contends that he lacks the political capital required to close the prison, as if political capital is fixed and not in constant need of regeneration. His impotence on Guantanamo suggests the dubiousness of his inaugural assumption that the nation could move forward on Guantanamo without looking back, without a rigorous historical accounting. By sidestepping the unsavory but nevertheless essential task of investigating and assigning responsibility for exactly what went on at Guantanamo and elsewhere in the aftermath of 9/11, the president has inadvertently assured its longevity. So I'm happy to return to contemporary developments at Guantanamo in the Q&A. I'm especially eager to hear your suggestions about how to move forward. But from now, I'd like to turn our attention to the question of what Obama would have learned had he engaged in a real examination of Guantanamo's role in U.S. history, both past and more recent. To put it mildly, America's interest in and history of Guantanamo is not altogether flattering, as he would have learned. I'm going to do it, as I say, with a pointer, and I'll sort of walk around, but as I say, by all means, ask questions or interrupt. I think I can come back to this if you have any questions about it.
Yeah, before you leave that slide,
Yeah.
would you just orient us? Is north?
I'm really going to orient you in a second, but yes. This is south, this is north, this is west, and this is east. But I promise to do a much better job of orienting you.
Is that the end of the island?
No. Just give me 1 second.
Okay.
But before that, I want to have a little quiz. Does everybody, maybe that's a different way, know what this is? Are there any students here? Do you guys? Who are the students? Are you guys students? Do you guys know what this is? Mount Vernon. Does everybody know that? Do you know where Mount Vernon got its name? This is really a test of, this is the way I figured out if you read the book. Anybody? So no. So Mount Vernon got its name for the British admiral that George Washington's half-brother Lawrence served within Guantanamo Bay for 3 months in 1741. Right? And the two became very, very close. Many of the people on what was a big British expedition down to the West Indies, that England wanted to attack Spanish holdings and unlock the Spanish monopoly on trade in the West Indies. Many of the British leaders, the generals, the sailors, basically despised the Americans, except for Vernon was really unusual and became very close to Washington. That is Lawrence Washington, George's brother, and Lawrence Washington stayed on Vernon's ship while it was anchored for 3 hot months in the summer in Guantanamo, and I've been there in the summer, and it's hot and not very nice, and so it's a lot nicer for him to be there. And in the book I suggest actually that the original Mount Vernon may have been, in Washington's mind, the original site may have been meant to be in Cuba, because both Lawrence and Vernon make these glowing reports, and these glowing reports back to the colonies in Washington's case, and to England in Vernon's case, about how marvelous a place Guantanamo is. Vernon actually speaking about Guantanamo as the Promised Land. And the Promised Land, actually not himself, he said the Americans, an early use of the term American in colonial history, the Americans have come to think of it as the land of promise already, Vernon writes home to the Admiralty. So Americans were licking their lips not only about Guantanamo, but about Cuba in this time, and I'll explain why in a second. So the title of this talk is The View from Monticello. It could have been The View from Monticello or Mount Vernon, you may have, and I'll explain that too. So here's Monticello. And those of you who've been there know that this is the front of Monticello, and it faces east over the tidewater, looking down over the valleys, and the settled part, what was the settled part of the state when Jefferson was first settling the estate. It was first owned by his father. But the backside is what interests me, and is the view from Monticello. It's the look westward that so consumed Jefferson. And quick tour. This is the James River here, and this is roughly where Charlottesville is. Jefferson's dad, Peter, was a surveyor, like, by the way, George Washington's father, also a surveyor. And these guys understood the connection between, right, the land on the other side of the Allegheny Mountains that they wanted to eventually develop, and the river system that would connect it to the commerce of the world. So I'll just go back for 1 second. Here's the very nicely planted garden. If you think of Jefferson imagining planting gardens, this new nation will plant gardens all over, he knew that if they're going to ship the product of these gardens and their production out to the rest of the world, they weren't going to do it all through Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia. That is, those who wanted to harvest the resources of what become the breadbasket of the United States, that is this, knew that they couldn't just bring it east over the Allegheny Mountains, simply too cumbersome. That to do it, they would have to connect, right? They'd have to ship these goods down the Ohio, Missouri, Mississippi River, out of New Orleans, and ultimately down to New Orleans and out the Gulf of Mexico. So let me go back just for a second. So when Jefferson looks out the back of Monticello, he actually sees the Gulf of Mexico. Half the watershed, half the rain that falls on this watershed drains into the Atlantic, right down the James and these other rivers into the Potomac and so on. But the other half actually drains 1,000 miles further south into the Gulf of Mexico. And Jefferson knew that and wrote about that with great passion. There's an interesting river here that's called the New River. Once again, this is Charlottesville. Right? This is a river called the New River, rare in the United States, and it's one of the few that runs absolutely due north-south. From south to north, right? Goes through the mountains here in today's Fayetteville, West Virginia, joins the great New Conaway River, and ultimately the Ohio River, and then flows into the Mississippi River. And so that any of the goods that were produced here, we're going to exit not on the Atlantic coast that we know so well, or the northern Atlantic coast, the mid-Atlantic coast, but actually would exit through here. But here's the thing that they also knew, that what Lawrence Washington was taught by Edward Vernon in Guantanamo. So those who hope to harvest the resources of the United States breadbasket, the North American breadbasket, have to control those rivers. Those rivers end up in New Orleans. To control those rivers is a little bit tricky, trickier than you might imagine, because current in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea runs clockwise. It enters through the Windward Passage and some other passages in the Caribbean, goes into the Gulf of Mexico, and exits through the Florida Straits. So this is called the Yucatan Channel. Current comes into this toward the Gulf and ultimately New Orleans through the Yucatan Channel that exits through the Florida Straits. Travel against this current was difficult, sometimes lethal. So that if you wanted to control commerce, you had to control New Orleans. If you wanted to control New Orleans, you had to control the Gulf of Mexico. But if you wanted to control the Gulf of Mexico, you had to control the Caribbean Sea, and the guardian of the Caribbean Sea, and again, these guys knew it, they talked about it explicitly, is Cuba. And the biggest, best passage into the Caribbean, right, is the Windward Passage on which sits Guantanamo Bay. So if you ever look at a map, just of what we call the Western Hemisphere, this construct called the Western Hemisphere, I actually make the argument it's pretty close that if you had the whole map and you spun it, it would spin on Guantanamo Bay. So Guantanamo is the heart, indeed the filter, of this Atlantic commercial world. And they knew it. They knew it in England, they knew it in North America, they knew it in the colonies, they knew it up and down the seaboard, the Spanish knew it, the British knew it, and Vernon knew it, and Jefferson. So in fact, to be perfectly honest, Jefferson doesn't talk much about Guantanamo. I think there's a single reference. But Vernon did, and people after Jefferson did. Jefferson talks about Cuba as a whole. Jefferson wants Cuba. He even argues in an obscure part of the Notes on the State of Virginia that in fact Cuba was once part of the continental United States when sea levels were lower. But they wanted to control, they thought if they could control this area, then they would be in good shape to dominate the commercial world. And I actually think that, because we know a lot about the triangular trade, and the triangular trade was not just in slaves, but it was in produce, that in fact it's the entire Atlantic world. the Caribbean, it's not an overstatement to argue that the Caribbean in control of this, and then, you know, if I want to go a little hyperbolic, the Windward Passage in Guantanamo is essential for control of the Atlantic world. Lawrence Washington thought so, Vernon thought so, and it's pretty striking. So we can come back and deconstruct some of those gigantic claims, but there you have it. So, to the person who wanted to know where Guantanamo is vis-a-vis Cuba, this is Cuba. It's way down on the southeast tip, and I'll have more pictures of it in a second. There are, of course, other passages numerous other passages into the Caribbean Sea, but this is by far the biggest and the deepest. This is the Cayman Trench, by the way, the second deepest trench in the world. And I'll say something about the depth of it, because that was great for the U.S. submarine practice once the submarines came into Guantanamo. But this is the Cayman Trench. It's incredibly deep. And you know, this is just, eventually there'll be a Panama Canal, right? And if you want to go from the Panama Canal up to New York, you would go right through the Windward Passage. So again, I'll come back, slow down, we can talk more about it. So here you have it again. Here's the Cayman Trench, right off of which is Guantanamo. The geology of this, I tell the story in the book, is phenomenal. Cuba is immensely complicated. The trench exists because of this amazing geological tear that left Cuba perched precipitously right at the end of the continental shelf. When Haiti and the Dominican Republic tore away, you know, millions of years ago. And so Cuba is just barely where it is, but it makes it a really interesting place, an important place. So I'm going to go do some close-ups. This is the great southeast tip of Cuba, Baracoa, marvelous place to visit. And this is a tip near a place called Niquero, where Fidel Castro landed when he came to attack Cuba in 1956. Came home to attack Cuba. The Batista regime. We can talk about that later. So here's the bay. So I know I'm in your way, and I promise to move around, so I'm democratically in your way. I move some people's way, sometimes at others. This is the entire bay. This is the naval base. This little thing cuts over here, cross here. This is the famed Watergate. This is the Northeast Gate, the site of a lot of Cold War confrontations between the United States and Cuba. And it goes down here. This is the prison area. This is the so-called good Guantanamo. This is the bad Guantanamo. But it's all, and this is, there's an old airfield here. The new airfield that's used is here. It's a really tricky place to have as a prison, because all the detainees had to be offloaded here and brought across the bay. Jeff Johnson will be here next week, but I quote him is it next week? Yeah. Vociferously in the book, or liberally in the book. He and others were saying Guantanamo is not the place to have a sensitive detention detention It's just insane, and he can talk more about that. I can talk a little bit about it later, but it's just a really difficult place to have a detention facility. Super isolated, not near anything. Every single thing that's brought to the base because of the embargo has to be brought by the United States. Cuba can't just supply us with stuff. And then the movement of detainees is really tricky. Here's where the detainees are staying, most of them. And the place where they go for the tribunals, so-called Camp Justice, right? Only the United States can come up with such a great term, is all the way down here. So to move them around is exceedingly hard. We'll talk about that. This is a really cool map that I loved. 1751, I think. It shows the legacy of the Vernon, Washington trip. I tell this story in the book. It's a long story, kind of an interesting one. When they landed in Guantanamo Bay in 1740, Guantanamo was basically unoccupied. When the United States landed in 1898, it was basically unprotected. It's acknowledged to be one of the great harbors in the world. It's acknowledged to be one of the most strategic harbors in the world. And yet it's been empty, really, until the United States arrived in 1898. It's a complicated reason. I don't know if any of you have ever read Edmund Morgan's book, American Slavery, American Freedom, but there's always an interesting tension in colonial societies between the center and the periphery. And the Spanish center, the Spaniards were way overstretched in the colonial times. And they had a nice city in Havana, they had a nice city in Santiago, and people said, you have to develop Guantanamo. There'll be pirates, they'll be attacked by everybody, we have to just develop that. And millions of beautiful plans were drawn up, not millions, but countless, and they were never put to use. So that when these guys come here, when Vernon comes here in 1740, and 1741 by the time they actually come into Guantanamo, and when Teddy Roosevelt and those guys come later, Roosevelt lands just down the way, but when the U.S. Navy comes in 1898, it's totally empty. There's a little bit of people to shoot at, and to be shot at by, but not many, and it was easy for the U.S. to take it. And this is where the U.S. went. There's something called the Guantanamo River, and if I could just share you a little of a hyperbole. Now maybe I'll skip it just for the sake of time, but again, Vernon writing letters home saying this is the greatest place I've ever been. And this guy knew the entire, the Caribbean Sea down to the most obscure dot. And he's looking at this and writing home how great it is. And this is where I sort of hypothesized that maybe Washington, who really loved Vernon, was thinking of honoring him by actually building a place, a house here. Because the Americans wanted to come and settle this whole area because it was immensely rich and valuable. But this is the remnant, the historical legacy of the U.S. presence there. These are their tents, and that's their little landing, and that's where the fortifications, and so it's kind of interesting. I love maps, as you can see. This is my shot. So why all the praise for Guantanamo? Well, it's huge. It's really big. And as you'll see in a minute, it's extremely deep, and it's both protectable, but it's not so protected like Santiago or Havana Harbor, for instance, that it's easy to just repel the people who are coming into it. It has a fairly generous entrance. The the Spaniards, as I say, when they were thinking about developing the bay, they had developed a plan where they thought they could close it off, but it wasn't going to be very easy. This is looking out from the ocean. I asked the people who were touring me around in 2005 to take me out into the harbor so I could look at it the way Columbus might have looked at it, because Columbus actually came into Guantanamo on his second voyage to the New World. And he too called it Great Port, Puerto Grande, and left, spent the afternoon there, stole a lot of fish that were being prepared by the local Indians, and then left the next morning, sure that he had discovered the continent, by the way. I guess this was India or maybe China. But this is what he would see as you come around into the bay, and the bay is up here, and the U.S. presence is around this corner. So this is what I call the southeast corner of the bay. This is the northeast corner of the bay. This is where, the southeast? Yeah, sorry, southwest right here. This is where the airfield is, where they bring in the detainees. And they have to cross this. And sometimes it is rough. The Windward Passage is unbelievably rough. On my first visit, in fact, I almost didn't get away after 3 sort of maddening days. That you can imagine what it's like to be in control of people trying to keep every secret when there's a historian around snooping around. And after 3 days, I was ready to leave, and there was a storm, just an ordinary October storm, and no boats could cross. We had waves as big as this ceiling and bigger in the harbor. So it's really it's complicated, interesting harbor, but it's big. This is now going up the bay toward what I call the Watergate, toward the property of Cuba. So this is a U.S. fence post here, looking, can you guys see, looking into the Cuban part of the bay, the top part of the bay, which is called Moa Bay. That again is my shot. Forgive me for it not being very remarkable. But here, just give you a sense. This is a fairly small part of the bay. This is where the airways that's used now. That's the other part. This is now looking out to sea, looking south. Right. This is the west. This is the east. And I counted, I don't know, what was it, 56 ships or something? And these were not small ships, as you'll see in a second, easily at anchor there. So the whole fleet used to come in there in the early 20th century and have, well, they trained there for a whole century, but they used to rendezvous, the Atlantic and the Pacific fleets, after the Panama Canal was built in Guantanamo for shakedown, for training, for planning, strategy sessions. some of the size of the boats, those are aircraft carriers, I think, aren't they? Yeah. So humongous. This is another, again, just a small part. This is the beginning of the Sierra Maestra Mountains in the southwest point over there. There's again the size, just how the bay just could suck it up. Vernon said that, this incredible bay with, quote unquote, with room for all the shipping in the Thames, he said. Room for all the shipping in the Thames. Here's the other thing. As I said, the Cayman Trench is just off, and these are yards, not feet. And if you look in here, there's a lot of depth in the bay for the big boats. But look what happens right off here. It plummets 847 feet. So yards, 2,400 feet, and then it just drops right there. So submarine commanders loved Guantanamo Bay once submarines became the big thing later in the 20th century. It became a great place to have submarine training. So Guantanamo had nuclear subs coming in, parading around. Guantanamo really, it was a sleepy little place until World War II, where it became a linchpin in the escort system that escorted shipping through the Panama Canal up the eastern coast and over to England in the war during World War II, and it became essential for that. Before that, it was pretty sleepy, but then it really took off in the 40s and especially the 50s, and I'll show you some images. But just look at this. So 39 feet, 40 feet in here, well up the bay, pretty deep, all in here. This is just the mouth. That's the airfield. This is the other side where most of the construction and development is. So that's just a pause to give you guys a second. I don't want to spend much time talking about the Spanish-American War, but that's when we got it, right? You probably know this story. We intervened in what was really the Cuban War of Independence in 1898 after it was 3 years old and virtually won. I mean, we could argue a little bit about that, but not much. And then once it was over, after a couple of shots were fired, right, we forbade the Cubans to attend the armistice by which we took over their part of Cuba, eastern Cuba, Santiago, and then we forbade them to attend the Paris Peace Conference. And then just after the war, we said you can be independent if you accept something called the Platt Amendment, which guaranteed us the right to intervene at will in Cuban affairs and also gave us the right to Guantanamo and a few other bases that were never really fulfilled. But with the Platt Amendment, we then dominated Cuba for the next 35 years or so, and then thereafter in other ways. So it was 1898 that we actually formally, we intervened. We captured, really defeated the Spanish in our minds, and got the right to this place that we're now talking about. We never left. I mean, formally, our lease started in 1903, I don't know why I'm forgetting that, excuse me. Cuba became formally independent in May 1902. I think it was the next year that we officially got Guantanamo. But we were always there. We never left. So some people will say, oh, the Americans left and came back. No, we were always in Guantanamo, using it, planning things. A few quotes that I really love. This is the first on the left is from military Governor Leonard Wood, who after the Cubans signed the Platt Amendment, which we forced down their throat, we would not leave, and the military occupation that followed the Spanish-American War. We would not leave Cuba unless they signed into their constitution something called the Platt Amendment that gave us the right to intervene, as I've said, and gave us Guantanamo. And then he wrote this to the new President Roosevelt. He said, there is, of course, little or no independence left in Cuba under the Platt Amendment. And this still bothers Cubans, by the way. Fidel Castro, this partly justified his policy in his mind toward the United States many, many years later. This too. There's so much national grief and anger throughout the island. This is when we didn't allow them to attend the armistice. This was the very general who basically won, defeated the Spaniards, but was left out of the armistice. This is him speaking, writing to a friend, maybe his son, I think. So much natural anger and grief throughout the island, people haven't been able to celebrate the triumph of the end of their former ruler's power. So Cubans really believed that was the case up through through the application of Platt in 1934, up to the Revolution and beyond. you know, they're still struggling in their minds. I'm now doing a book, as David mentioned, on Castro. They're still struggling in their mind for legitimacy and recognition as a country. And we don't recognize that they're independent, their first independent government, that is Castro's government. I know there's obvious reasons, but we've never recognized it as legitimate. And so we've never, in their minds, recognized an independent Cuba. So that's pretty powerful. I think the facts support them, the ideology is gone. Okay, so these I love. This is from the Guantanamo, one of the Guantanamo student school yearbooks in, I think, 1958. And one of the great things, parts of this history is the myth that Americans propagate that Guantanamo is this ideal, lovely little American place that is the America that there would be if it could be. And that it's a very happy place. The Cubans like us, we like the Cubans, we do a lot for Cuban development, they're happy that we're here. The whole thing is a hoax, and Jeff Johnson might be able to speak to a little bit of it next week. I think that, in fact, before I started pestering him about my work when I first met him there in 2005, he basically believed it. And I said, Jeff, that's patently false. The Cubans did not approve of us coming and occupying Guantanamo Bay. They didn't like what we were doing there since. And the Bay didn't really benefit Eastern Cuba, as I'll show you in a second. But Americans like the Bay and live this kind of a life there. This is the 1950s. What's happening in the 1950s when Guantanamo is enjoying these kind of events? This is the senior prom. Well, you have all sorts of cultural revolution, right? You have feminism and civil rights upheaval. You have the youth movement, and all these things are upsetting this precious notion of the perfect America back home. And Americans are going down to Guantanamo and maybe some other places, but Guantanamo like nowhere else, and creating the life, this ideal life that they think is being torn asunder in the United States. This 1958, the senior prom, this is a picture not of Southern California, this isn't Palm Springs, this is Guantanamo. The good life at Guantanamo. And there's golf courses there back then, and there still are. And I think that the pictures speak way more eloquently than I can. Here's another. Labor was incredibly cheap. Life was, it was better. The 50s were obviously a period of relative economic stability and growth expansion in the United States, but it was still expensive for middle-class families to live the good life. And if you joined the military and you ended up in Guantanamo, you had a nice life. They could go wherever they want. They used to talk about the great safety of the place, no drugs, no this, no that. No racial problems, because no other races. They didn't have to speak Cuban because there were Jamaican servants and Cuban servants. The Cuban servants could clean the houses and the Jamaicans could talk to them and serve them dinner. And they could get good and easy help for virtually free. When I was on my first trip to Guantanamo, on this little plane, it was a chartered plane out of Fort Lauderdale, there were 10 or 13, 14 or I guess actually there were 16 Filipino workers who had come from the Philippines that day, landed in the airport in Fort Lauderdale, got on this plane right away, and landed in Guantanamo and worked in Guantanamo for $2 and something cents an hour. And then they were coming, and then when I left, I was on the plane with some of them going out. So cheap labor has been a thing at Guantanamo. Jonna Lippman can talk more about that next week, because she's the expert on labor at Guantanamo. But these guys benefited from being there at this time, where, as I said, they basically lived. In their minds, I guess one officer said they lived, what was it? We lived the American dream. So here you go. And this was part of it. Nice place, safe place to sail. I just love it. Well, you can't make this up. A little yacht sailing below the battleship. They're unlikely to be attacked. And so there are some few minorities, and some people push back and say, well, there are a few, there's a little black girl there, and the other cute kids, and it's nice. And the racial composition of the U.S. Navy in the 50s was very white, and it's no accident. The policy really began in the late 1890s, when the new Navy, a Navy that was going to be more reliant on technology, hence less reliant on prepsters who knew how to sail up and down the ports of the East Coast, could then actually, with all the problems, not just prepsters, but in fact, right, shipboard areas like Boston, New York are kind of actually cosmopolitan. So the new Navy was a little bit threatened by the look of how things were sort of panning out, and then because of technological developments, we're able to tap the Midwest very specifically for their folks, for the people, the midshipmen, and the kids who would be on these boats and do all their work. And so the Navy became exceedingly white, and that policy lasted through the 1950s and 60s, so that officers who I interviewed who were at Guantanamo in the 60s would talk about. There were African Americans at the base, and they were in the Navy, but they were waiting at the tables of the officers in Guantanamo as they ate their meals and lived their life. So racial issues is part of what makes the racial segregation is part of what makes Guantanamo distinct. And it was part of a much bigger policy. And it's part of what made it so pleasant for so many of these families, according to them. Their words, you can read their words. This is modern Guantanamo. This was Halloween 2005 or 2006. I was there a couple times. So the life persists. It's still talked about as a modern Mayberry. By the way, Mayberry wasn't good enough in the 50s, so they talked about it as oh, it's so good, it's like the 1920s, the other most reactionary decade in American history. So in the 50s, they would say, oh, it's like the 20s when things were good. And now, they say, oh, it's like the 50s. And the 50s were good for some people, as we know. This is Guantanamo. Again, it's not Walnut Creek, California. It's good life at Guantanamo. That's at the Officers Club. Actually, everyone's allowed to be there. All the sailors and soldiers are allowed there. And that's just overlooking the bay. There's the golf course. I'm going to speed up so I can just stop talking and take questions. So like all myths, I suppose there's a grain of truth, but there's a dark side. Prohibition, by the way, was huge in Guantanamo. You could go and get a drink. This is Arleigh Burke, the right here, who becomes a big player in the Pentagon in the 1960s and during the Cold War episodes with Castro. That's Arleigh Burke in 1932 or something, or 31, down in Guantanamo drinking a Cristal beer with his maids. There was a lot of drinking at Guantanamo, a lot of exploitation, a lot of prostitution. This is in the nearby town of Caimanera, just outside the U.S. base. And this is a horrible picture. I have a better one, and I don't know where the good version is, so it's very grainy, but this is in a magazine called Liberty Magazine that was telling a story. It was an expose written by the wife of a Navy officer who said it was just literally unbearable to be there at Guantanamo. Women were isolated, they stayed in the house. The only times that they would go out would be to go into Caimanera and drink, and you know what happens when too many guys drink and there are too few women around. And that happened at Guantanamo. This is the area where the brothels were in the same town. There was a very robust prostitution, sort of industrial prostitution industry. And in fact, so industrial that the Navy would station doctors and chemists to screen the different people for VD and to inject them with this and inject them with that. If you know anything about the medical history of this, it's in some ways laughable, but it was open. The sailors would be brought here, dropped off, picked up, and so on. This is from the 50s or 60s. This isn't. When I was there, on one of my trips, I was on a beautiful patio at the commanding officer's house, having at a cocktail party, and it's a very colonial, early colonial sort of social scene with a lot of guys and few women, as I'm saying, and then suddenly, forgive me, 40 very strikingly attractive women came out on the patio, and I sort of scratched my head and said, "This doesn't seem right," and I couldn't figure it. Someone sort of knocked me on my shoulder and said, "Stop staring." And I said, "Well, what's going on?" They said, "Oh, it's the Washington Redskins cheerleaders brought down to entertain the guys." And this happens to be the Kansas City cheerleaders. Different shot. I didn't get any shots from that, but so that's Guantanamo. It's kind of an old boy's place still. So I said, talk about this. One of the myths is that we helped the Navy base, gave thousands of jobs, good pay, helped develop the southeast Cuba, and especially Guantanamo City, which again Janet will talk about next week, which is 16 miles down up the bay. But if you look at this, it's what you see is not a lot of development. You actually see a lot of poverty. Look at the clothes. Back here are actually some of the base women buying things, and here you can see they're much more fancily clad. But this is a scene, I could have brought any number of photographs that show what life is like in Guantanamo at the heart of the supposedly thriving base. This is local Carmenera, another person who helped me with, who had been there, an enlisted man with tons of photos who wanted to talk about Guantanamo, just gave me a ton of photos. This is Carmenera and the little kids in the street who, very, very kind. A lot of Americans lived off the base because as it grew and boomed in the 50s, there were 12,000 or so, or 13,000 Americans there, which is fairly big, and about the biggest it ever was. And so some had to live in the nearby town of Carmenera, it's just outside the Watergate. Okay, so I'm going to conclude. Here's just more shots. Here's Camp Justice, where the commissions are going on. This is a shot by a friend of mine whose images I use in the book. You may have seen these on the front page of the New York Times. His name is Louis Palou. He's a great photographer and is awarded for his photography by being printed everywhere. These sort of speak for themselves. This is an quote-unquote interview room in one of the prisons. That is one of the prisoners in the Supermax. There are two Supermax facilities there. And you go in there, and outside the prison are all sorts of nice things that you might use to live a life in jail. But I never saw anyone out enjoying any of the things outside these cells when I was there. And this is the image that you really saw. Prisoners alone, in this case praying. But if you look at the cell, it's not very comfortable. So the 2000s recapitulated something that happened in Guantanamo, two migration crises in the 90s, when in 2 episodes, 85,000 Cubans and Haitians were detained behind barbed wire at Guantanamo in the 90s under both Bush 1 and Clinton. 85,000, not all at once, but processed through. Incredibly explosive. Without access to lawyers, with no press, no free press, no access to lawyers, the same kind of stuff that we've been doing now, under the same justification that Guantanamo is sovereign territory. So they said, so we said, so the Bush administration argued, so Clinton, so Bush 1. It's sovereign territory of Cuba, hence the U.S. Constitution doesn't apply there. So we can do whatever we want, and we'll do whatever we want. And this was just the boats that the Haitian boaters came in. They ended up in Guantanamo in the 90s. They were trying to escape to the United States. They ended up in Cuba, and many of the Haitians were repatriated. Many of the Cubans, because there were several different episodes going on at once, got to go to Florida, but the Haitians happened to be the wrong color, so they had to go back to Haiti. Here's another friend of mine who I met, took these photos of the tarmac. That's the old airfield in 1994. Big divisions here. This would be like going to a football game, because rough crowd, and then being told 85,000 of you, okay, you don't get to leave. and we're going to separate children over here, women over there. We'll separate you, we'll pull you, and we'll keep you there for 8, 9, 10 months without any legal recourse, any right to anything. And that's how the guys who actually saw this, I never saw this, described this. These separate camps, people divided from one another. Beautiful picture of some Haitian kids. These are Cubans, so as I said, there are two things going on at once. There are Haitians in Guantanamo and Cubans at the same time. Cubans being treated a lot better. This is some of the Cuban artwork. I mean, there were doctors, there were artists, there were professionals, there were, poets, prize winners, all caught up in both sides, both on the Haitian side and the Cuban side at this time. And these are some of the art. This is some of the artwork some of the Cubans did while at Guantanamo. People would fly in, by the way, from New York, from Paris, sweep up this art and fly away. Some of the Cubans sold some of this art for thousands of dollars. They speak for themselves. And I'll just stop here. This is, again, one of the more powerful ones. All right. Should we turn on the lights and let's just have a conversation and ideally, if you ask questions of fact, I'm happy to answer them. If you ask questions of policy, it'd be fun if we could actually speak to each other, not just me. But yeah.
This, first of all, great talk, fascinating research, interesting topic. And my question actually is about both the Spanish-American War experience and then sort of the persistence of Guantanamo as an entity. And then also, I would argue, a lack of awareness about Guantanamo as an entity by and large in the United States. So in the Spanish-American War experience, right after the acquisition of the Philippines, a wave of missionaries and U.S. educators go to the Philippines, and they have this idealistic sort of thrust, and what happens is that they see what is actually going on in the Philippines, and they're writing letters home. And very significantly, those letters are passed around to communities in, say, Ann Arbor, Michigan, or Chicago, Illinois, and it turns public opinion against the war. I wonder if it seems there's a lack of that in some sense of having non-military individuals have any sort of presence in Guantanamo, where they're actually viewing some of the injustices that are going on and writing back home and raising any sort of public awareness. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the detachment between those two experiences and what that means?
Maybe. First of all, I know the Philippines because I wrote a book partly that included William James and the Philippines, Mark Twain in there. So that's interesting. It's a real, it seems like a real contrast. So what happened in Guantanamo in the East is that you had a lot of sugar production already, but fairly undeveloped compared to the rest of Cuba. And you had an inundation of Americans, but they weren't complaining a lot about the conditions on the ground. You didn't have the annexation that you had in the Philippines. You had an American military occupation, and that occupation did a lot of things that the American military does. They laid down a lot of roads. They got rid of smallpox. They did this and they did that. So sort of morally, though it was extremely fraught from the Cuban perspective, right? Remember the Teller Amendment preceded the U.S. entry here. I don't know if any of you guys remember what the Teller Amendment was, but the U.S. promised just before entering the war, as a little rider to the Declaration of War, Congress attached this thing that said, "We won't annex this place. We're committed to Cuba's independence." So it looked a lot better, on the face of it anyway, than the situation in the Philippines. But 45,000 Americans went to Cuba in the immediate aftermath, in the decade and a half after the occupation. That's a lot. 45,000 went to settle. Tons more went to do other things. 45,000 went to settle. And the East, the Far East, the Guantanamo area became the richest part of Cuba and the site of the biggest development of Cuban sugar. And so Cubans talk about the Americanization of Cuba, but especially of the East. So Americans went there in droves, civilians as well as military, but they went in a really different way. They went to make money. And it was completely fraught. in the 1906 there was a 3-year occupation, right? The U.S. intervened. Having left Cuba in 1902, they went back in 1906, stayed for 3 years and left again. But the U.S. Navy kept going, entering. Whenever there was any upheaval, in 1912 there was a sort of democratic revolution of, oh no, black Cubans who were fed up with what was going on, and they wanted the U.S. to intervene. So Cubans are smart, super smart, and they were manipulating Platt, thinking that if we make enough controversy here, the U.S. will come over, they'll overthrow this government that we don't like, and there may be a chance that we could reestablish our power when the Americans leave. So they again and again and again, and that's probably why Platt was ultimately abrogated in 1934, was because the Cubans were using it to their advantage more than the Americans, so they thought. The Americans turned out to do perfectly well once Platt was abrogated in 1934, right? They lost no power, little control, nothing. So the U.S. intervened repeatedly, the U.S. Navy, going around occupying different parts, setting up roadblocks around the plantations to protect U.S. property in Cuba in this time. So this doesn't really answer your question, except for that they were there, but there were missionaries there saying, we have to do this and that. Well, but I just, my gut sense, and I don't know this aspect of it as well as you do, was that there was a sense that this is better. I mean, Leonard Wood was pretty good in those times, right? Because he was totally paternalistic, but he was at least paternalistic. He thought he was doing what's good for Cuba. The book is full of these descriptions by U.S. journalists and others of the most condescending things in the entire world. That say the Cubans can't do anything. Part of the reason that America was able to exclude Cubans from the armistice and then the Treaty of Paris was because there was a successful campaign to make them into little children. And to say that they did nothing, they had nothing to do with it. And you had some generals, some captains of the Navy, some of the commanders saying, oh my God, this is ridiculous. Cubans were unbelievable. And then they just get squashed by the likes of, some of our great writers, imagine, culprits, just saying Cubans, they can't do anything, they need us. So that's my response to that. But the juxtaposition, I think, is based primarily on annexation versus, hey, we're just here for them.
Yeah, that's a big difference.
Anybody else?
The concept of spin never changes.
There's a lot of spin. I'm writing on Castro, and everyone thinks Castro invented spin, but no, there's no spin. Yes?
Based on what you said, if you divvy up this time period into, segments that run from 1898 to the abrogation of Platt in the 30s, to the Castro Revolution in 59, to 2001, in those segments of time, has there been any evolution of any movement in this country that argues that we should, in fact, for a variety of reasons, return the entire Guantanamo area to Cuba? Somewhat similar, after all, the Philippines eventually more or less got its independence, and Panama got its canal.
Yeah, so the answer is yes. And it's been sporadic. First of all, there was a lot of people who were thinking, there's a huge debate that again features in the book, whereby people said this is the stupidest place to have a base because it's unprotectable. I mean, look, it is surrounded by hills. And the Cubans could wipe out Guantanamo and could have done so in the 60s in the Cold War episodes that I alluded to but didn't describe, like that, and the U.S. knew it. And so honest ship commanders were saying, this place, back in the 1905, but also then in the 1960s, saying this place is ridiculous and indefensible. Let's be honest about that. Again, there was so much spin that always wasn't able to be heard. Adlai Stevenson, when he was at the UN, was the U.S. representative at the UN, broached the topic in the 60s, and Kennedy wouldn't hear of it. And then both Carter and Reagan broached the topic, and again, they were shot down very quickly by people in their own governments and in the military. But very interestingly, the military right now doesn't want it. The Navy doesn't want it at all. Jeff Johnson can speak to this next week. In fact, they're just holding it for the Coast Guard and for the migration folks and for the U.S. anti-drug efforts. They're sort of taking one for the team. It's costing them millions of dollars to keep it. It almost closed. I tell the story of it on September 10th. 2001. It was at minimum pillar, probably had fewer people than it had ever had in its, since the World War II. And the guy who was taking charge of it, who I then spoke to, who was, that's what Jeff Johnson did just before him. He was in charge of Public Works, was expecting the whole thing to be closed, and then bang, he gets a call the next day saying, okay, get ready. And in fact, this is just reminds me of a different story. Guantanamo is actually the site of some of the most interesting contact between the U.S. and Cuba. Since 1994, General Jack Sheehan, who gets so much criticism for being the devil in the Bosnia, was in charge of the U.S. Southern Command in the 1990s, and he had been there in the 1960s as a young Marine, and he was some of those guys firing shots up in the air at the Cuban guards across the at the northeast gate, and he said to people, he said, I don't want these guys to do what I'm doing there, because suddenly all these migrants started to arrive there, and there's this huge migrant operation, and Sheehan said, the last thing we need are any of the hotheads like me, to be shooting while this migrant operation is here, and we really need Guantanamo. Let's try to keep this quiet. He went down, he says, this is his story, the other people tell different stories. He said that he pulled out a napkin and he wrote "wanna talk" on it and handed it to a Cuban commuter, because there were still Cubans going back and forth across the fence to go, who worked on the base and went home. He said, give this to your commander on the other side, and the next day something came back, yes. And ever since, according to Sheehan, well, this is a fact, whether this is why or not, there has been a really interesting cooperation between Cuban and U.S. military at the Northeast Gate, including monthly meetings. And so that's just kind of interesting. But Sheehan, McCaffrey, all these generals that we all know about and that I cited in the book, none of them argue that we need Guantanamo. We, the Navy, militarily, Guantanamo is totally obsolete. They don't even train the boats there anymore. But we're just holding on to it. So just before 9/11, the place was emptied out, and who knows what its ultimate fate was. Minimum pillar means that the U.S. Navy keeps just enough people there so that Castro can claim that it hasn't been abandoned. And I mean like down to 100, down to 76, down to 30. It's just they're trying to squeeze it so that they can have it without spending any money there. And that was when America was relatively flush compared to right now.
So what's your assessment of, if it's no longer strategically so essential, what's the argument for holding on to it? Simply because Castro is there and in power and we don't want to give the Castro regime anything? Or is there something else going on?
Castro has liked it because he could say America's terrible, look, their base is here, and we've liked it because we can thumb our nose at Castro. There's been, I don't know. On the 10th anniversary of 9/11, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying, give Guantanamo back to Cuba. And I got, some people saying good idea, a lot of hate mail. It's right now, the argument is that, this is an area of great upheaval. You can imagine a democratic revolution in Cuba, and then given that it's Latin America or any other new country, you can imagine a counter-revolution, and you can imagine that Guantanamo Navy base would be useful for all sorts of different things. In a period of rising ocean levels, right, there's going to be unbelievable upheaval in the Caribbean area, if the Caribbean basin, if our estimates are right about rising sea levels, and you're going to need places to just help migrants. So, you don't necessarily, one of the great Assistant Secretary of State, Parmalee, just wrote a long piece that you can get online arguing after me that we should give Guantanamo back to Cuba, but he was saying you could give Guantanamo back to Cuba and even hold on to the prison. Because if you gave Guantanamo back to Cuba, presumably you'd be in negotiation with Cuba. You would be recognizing who they are, and we could have relations, better relations, because that would go a long way. So it's a huge symbolic thing. Go a long way toward improving relations with Cuba, and you could still, probably the Cubans would agree to have a prison. As Jeff Johnson will say next week, the hurdle involved in giving a place where they've been doing bombing, training, and exploiting, but there's unexploded ordnance and things like that, is immensely complicated. It is a real sinkhole of environmental misuse or abuse of the last 40 or 50 years. So that's going to be really complicated. But it's useful now. It's just not useful to the military. And it's really not useful to the military after 9/11 once the lawyers got in and the press. And McCaffrey says that in a piece that I have somewhere, I'd love to quote if I could only find it. He basically says, for 45 years, we had this perfect place where we could do whatever we want. That's ruined, he said. And you know, McCaffrey blurbs my book. It's not that he's a jerk. He just said, you know, maybe I'll pose it as a question. He's suggesting that nation states, even ones that uphold the rule of law, and who better than we in our minds, maybe need these little places where they can do things extrajudiciously. Does the rule of law depend on having these kind of places? I don't know. I would argue probably, although I'd be hard pressed to prove it if you pushed me, that probably we've had such places forever.
Is this a black site, essentially?
Well, so what's a black site? So when I published this book, there was a lot of talk about Camp 6. I showed you, or is it Camp 7? I showed you a Supermax image. There are two of those. I think those are 4 and 5. And there's 1, 2, and 3, and whatever. It's just places where different degrees of prisoners, detainees get to hang out. And the more dangerous ones go to 4 and 5, these Supermaxes. There was word about 6, and in fact, just after my book went to press, there was a great article in Harper's by I forget the author's name, who suggested that remember the rash of suicides that happened? I think that was 2006. That those actually might, you know, surprise, surprise, may not have all been suicides. That some of them may have actually been killed in this secret Camp 6. And if I went back to the images, I could show you where I think it is. There's several places that are away from the heart of the base, up these, you know, on these little ravines and down these roads, where, yeah, it seems like it's a CIA black site, and I think that that's largely acknowledged.
I mean, isn't it sort of a black site in public view?
Well,
Just being
yeah, you mean the whole thing.
Outside of the law, yeah, law.
Just to jump in on this,
Please.
at last week's talk, the opening talk, Jamil Jaffer, one of the lawyers for the American Civil Liberties Union, answered the simple question: is, you know, what would the goal be? And he said closing Guantanamo. But of course, what he meant was closing not just Guantanamo, but the whole network
Exactly.
of these black sites. Because there is a certain danger when we focus on Guantanamo that we say, oh, we've solved the problem. But in fact, you know, I forget the historian or the scholar who showed, you know, all the legal document for Bagram Air Force Base.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is identical kind of thing. Like, it's not our land, but we have total sovereignty. But the U.S. Constitution doesn't apply here.
Yeah.
We can do whatever we want to whoever we want.
Yeah.
And we obviously know there are multiple sites. So really, when we say close Guantanamo, I think many people should mean closing this network of
Yeah,
completely
well,
extra
and ending indefinite detention. That's the ACLU. So
Yeah.
Jamil is just part of a great cohort of guys. Ben Wiesner, who you probably also met in New York, I think, he argues about, you know, it's the indefinite detention. So, well, we don't do that. Sorry, you may have to release people, but we don't do that, or we do. I once argued long ago, maybe in 2008 or so, in the Guardian op-ed, a piece that we shouldn't close it just for those reasons. That we should, you know, we have a modicum of transparency, we have a modicum of habeas corpus. Let's actually let the light shine in and do it there in plain sight rather than in Bagram and these other places, because we were just picking up, that was when the, you know, I don't know if it was.
Basically, any foreign base
Yeah, exactly.
is potentially a site.
The abuse at Bagram that I cite in the book, I'm not original there, is makes some of the stuff that's going on in Gitmo bad. I mean, just the beating to death and the maceration of human bodies, that we picked up in those places. It's just unbelievable. David.
Just adding on a little bit to what Max said, that when Jamil Jaffer spoke last week, the thing that struck me the most was his comment that in fact during the Bush administration, we were taking these suspected terrorists and we were detaining them in Guantanamo, rounding them up and putting them in prison. And that very few have been added by the Obama administration, that in fact what Obama does is send the Predator drones out
Yes, exactly.
and just kills them.
Right. No, people argue that that's the problem with our liberal, response to Guantanamo, is that we've allowed Obama to then take this, well, Bush first, but then Obama to take this easier course. And so there are a lot of critics of the policy to say close Guantanamo. And this is the balance of Parmalee's argument is that just, we have the problem, as both of you are saying, and Jamil suggests time and time again, of this bigger, what are we going to do with these people, and are we going to just move it to the United States? That's no solution. Have indefinite detention in Kansas. so that's why Parmelee says, let's give the place back. It's an imperial enclave, imperialist enclave. There's no doubt about it. Let's give it back. It's not ours. They don't want it. They want us out. It would maybe be a symbolic act. It could unfreeze, U.S.-Cuban relations. But let's keep, let's keep it open and sort it out there. I don't know how you all feel about that. The argument against that is that in the world opinion right now, still, by the way, it's just this lightning point that it seems like it would be good to close down and make a museum out of or something. I mean, this was all part of my argument about keep it open. It wasn't that I love it. It's that in order to fix it and make it truly transparent, then you would have to acknowledge what went on there. You would have to have, sort of a truth and reconciliation, at least a truth commission. And then you could even have, as part of the base, you could have, a site where you examine and acknowledge what went on there publicly, as well as then having a place that was acceptable to the Human Rights Committee. I mean, I don't know.
That's what a mature nation might do.
That's what,
Right? I mean, wouldn't that be a very
but so
advanced?
I didn't say it, but so 75%, maybe more now, 70%, I forget, of the American people, that's us, think it's okay. So the mature nation, though, is us. And that, that's why that little, sorry about the harangue at the beginning, but that's what I'm trying to say. It's not, just so you know, I couldn't base this book on evidence from liberals, because nobody would read it. So I went to all the critics within the Bush administration, within the military, right? Republicans who thought this was a disaster, and there were tons. They were all I needed. And so it's not, as I say, bad, it's us. We're not writing our Congress, and we're not closing it down. We're not ending indefinite detention. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just curious about that, the issue of if you know what either current or fairly recent public opinion would be about it, because I was thinking about sort of the moral question of that. One of the reasons that I know why the U.S. got involved in the Spanish-American War back in the day was the argument of the Spanish were keeping Cubans in concentration camps, and that was sort of like the moral impetus to get the U.S. involved. And now here we are, 100+ years later, essentially with a similar kind of situation.
So I don't know what you're asking exactly, except for that.
Well, in terms of what U.S. and American U.S. opinion is, and whether
Yeah.
it's still favorable in the high, I think you said 70, 75, and that was
Yeah.
for it or against
Yeah,
it, or?
for it.
Yeah.
For keeping it open.
Okay.
For, I think you're putting your hands on a different thing, which I really like. And that is that, as I said, when I'm talking about the U.S. political economy with its, on the one hand, its unslakable appetite for land, labor, resources, and markets, but it's also its universalist political and moral aspiration. That's there too. I go to conferences in Cuba that talk about Bush. What happens in Cuba is you have extremely articulate, informed scholars that are as good as scholars anywhere, and then you have a bunch of sort of party hacks, and they let the party hacks speak first because that's why they get to have conferences. And then people sort of go to sleep, and then the smart people speak, and the people who are with open minds. The party hack line is that America is all about oil, and picture it as all about beets in the Teller Amendment or whatever it is, right? But I think that only gets a part of it. I think we are about that, but we also have this sort of assumption that what's good for us is good for everybody else, and we're going to give it to you whether you like it or not. And in fact, in the Spanish-American War, I do think that, and I say this in the book, what propelled us into there? Some combination of, I think, real justified, reaction to General Weiler and his concentration camp stuff. I mean, any guerrilla movement, by the way, is going to suffer from that because that's how you end a guerrilla movement. You make sure that there's no countryside for the guerrillas to hide in. So anyway, I just think that that's important to point out is that I didn't say this, but we went into the Spanish-American War with complex motives. So, in part, the Teller Amendment was supposed to come from Colorado Senator Teller because he wanted to protect U.S. beets, so he didn't want to annex Cuba and have those Cuban sugar compete with his Colorado beets.
I think you essentially said that, but it really occurred to me that there's even another irony in the sense of what does this say about democracy, which we're also trying to export. You're saying that 75% of the American people support continuing to operate Guantanamo, and I think that's largely reflected in Congress. So I'm thinking about a mature nation, I'm thinking more like, well, what about a mature Congress? I think that's largely what it would take. But I think it is it, or I'm kind of playing devil's advocate, but what does it say about a democracy that is in favor of, you know, extra constitutional rendition? I'm not sure there's an answer to that.
No, I'm lecturing on Tocqueville next week, and so there's no, you know, democracy has no monopoly
Has
on
no
good
what?
policy.
There's no monopoly.
I mean, that is, democracies are full of, I mean, democracies mob rule, so that's to be totally to be expected. It's not that I love aristocracies, but you can't, anyway. That's not a decent response, but I'm not surprised that in a democracy, we have a lot of stupid policy. That's been the case, and that's the argument against, you know, democracy
But
versus.
the twist is here, you know, usually it's like an unpopular policy is being, but in this case, it's a genuinely popular policy. So I mean, this is a real wrinkle.
Yeah, that's right.
It's just
Well,
the trouble with education and having the best medical system in the world. We've got a level of ignorance that's perpetuated.
Yeah,
Joy.
yeah.
Well,
We
sorry,
speak-
David, and then his hand, David.
Yeah, I just had a comment. It's just that, I mean, part of it is that I think for a lot of Americans at this point, Guantanamo is really out of sight. It's not like on the front pages.
Yeah,
And part of the idea of this Guantanamo memory project is actually to really keep that memory going, and especially because it was originated by this group that kind of came from the sites of conscience, to just possibly do that, to create some kind of site there that people in the future will be able to visit to learn about what happened there, as opposed to just erasing it entirely,
yeah,
which is where I think Americans
yeah.
are right now.
Yeah, I was in on the founding of the project, and it's just really interesting to be commemorating a place that isn't close. You know, that's still an atrocity that's still going on. It's really complicated. Yeah.
We speak of American public opinion about Guantanamo. Do we know if there's a consensus in Cuban American public opinion, particularly as it's centered in and around the Miami political active community about Guantanamo?
Well, I've given talks there that no one goes to. So I don't know. I'll tell you what I do know. For the book, I interviewed many handfuls of Cuban boat people who came to Miami under unbelievable duress, who escaped from Cuba into Guantanamo, and then from Guantanamo were able to go to Cuba.
Go to Miami.
Sorry, we were able to go to Miami, and they say 2-1, and I end the book with this: don't give it back. And they say, you know, so but that's a fairly rare breed, right? But they're not all zealots. They're not all these dead enders that we know about. You know, the generation that came in 59 and 60. And I think that they sort of understand what I said before, which is they can imagine a Cuba that has a revolution and being liberal, and that would be lovely. And then you think, well, give it back. But they could also imagine another counter-revolution, countless counter-revolutions, whereby Guantanamo becomes really useful again when a repressive government comes, and it's nice to have an escape hatch. So I don't tell a story here, but there are unbelievable stories of people swimming 30 miles from just off of Santiago against the current, with Cuban spotlights in the ocean, slathered in oil, engine oil, so sharks won't attack them, to get to the base. I have people stories going the other way, who come down the coast and the current shifts just before they get there, and somehow they make it. People going in boats. My favorite story, and I don't know how I let the editor cut this from the book, is this great story of this guy who is from a little farm in Santiago, who is a birder. They have pigeons, and they have carrier pigeons, and they train them and whatever. And he somehow manages to get a little boat. And it's not easy to get a boat in 94. Even Castro and Clinton signed an immigration accord, and it allowed some people to come, but then the window closed and you couldn't go. But most times Cubans don't, as we know, the Cuban government doesn't like to let people go. So for instance, if you want to swim, you can't just go buy some fins, because if you buy fins, they'll find out. And you buy one fin in May, and then you buy another fin in October, a snorkel in December, and you put together something. Well, this guy somehow got a boat, and somehow was able to get the boat toward the departure point. But their truck broke down, right? Combustion engines, two he's relying on, both the boat and the car. Unreliable in Cuba, and the truck broke down. Somehow we got some other guy coming back, maybe he had just dropped somebody off to take him down to the boat. So a tiny, rickety little boat like I showed you a picture of. They get on board, they wave goodbye to stricken friends and family. The last thing they load on is this a cage, it's a box, there's a sheet over it. And everyone's sort of scratching their head and saying, that's odd. They say goodbye, they go down, and somehow they make it. You have to go really early because when the wind whips up in mid-morning in the winter passage, you're just going to get sunk. But they make it, they get off the mouth of the bay, and then the Coast Guard comes down and meets them and says, okay, we'll take you in, because you're Cubans, not Asians, and we want you here. And just before they get on the Coast Guard boat, because they often sink the boat that they came on, they rip a sheet off the cage, and they release two passenger pigeons into the air. And they fly, they rise, and they fly, and they disappear over the escarpment of the Sierra Maestra, southeast Cuba. And 4 hours later, they arrive over the air in this little town off near Santiago, and they bear this message. Llegamos bien a las 11:30 de la mañana a Guantanamo Bay. And the pigeons made it home, and they said, we're safe. And that's how people found out. So, I mean, these are, I have goosebumps just telling the story. These are amazing stories, and it's full of them. And those people have always looked at, by the way, Guantanamo as a safety valve. It's their Wild West. It's both their frontier, but it's also their safety valve. And they want it there. And they wanted to be sure that post-Castro, post-whomever else, so that in 2080, when there's some repressive government in Cuba, they have a path to the United States. And that's really compelling, I think. This part of Cuba, by the way, is the site of the beginning of every revolution, as far as I know. I'm sure a Cuban would tell me I'm nuts. The ones I know about in Cuba, the far east Cuba, 700 miles from Havana. It's the most mountainous part. You can hide there. You can have an army there. You can land there for Castro. You can land there if you're Hatui, fleeing the Spaniards in 1498. You can land there, whoever you are, and start your revolution. So one after another has done it. All the great revolutions that we know about, 1868, 1895, 1959, they all started in the Far East, in and around Guantanamo, because it's this amazing place. It's been this place, the go-to place. If you're a racial minority, or you're a gay and lesbian, and you're trying to escape Castro's, people in the 1960s, you go to Guantanamo. You go to the east and for their resources and other connections. Probably I should shut up. What do you think?
Unless there are any more
He must
questions,
be
I think
tired.
that,
I
I thank Jonathan, but I'd also like to,
Thank you.
something I neglected at the beginning is thank all the people who helped to fund this series, which is the Dean of Humanities and the Vice Chancellor for Advancement, John Kennedy, and a number of departments from the History Department, Architecture, Public Policy, the Commonwealth Honors College, and I'm probably leaving out somebody, but anyway, it's taken a whole group of people to make this event happen, and Jonathan, I'm really happy that you were able to come.
May I
Thanks
just
so much.
say before we all part, I found every word of this absolutely fascinating and a terrific counterweight to my own Guantanamo experience.
Ooh.
As a child, in
Great.
1945, I was 6 years old and I lived on the base. The fat cat life that you described, absolutely accurate. It was idyllic for a child.
Wow. So
I had free run of
could
the
have been in
base.
that picture.
who are you
I,
with?
no, I looked at that picture. I was not in that picture. That was,
Who was your? Who
my
were your
father was a lieutenant in the Navy,
What was his name?
But it-
Edward Cleary.
But it was similar on other naval bases that you may have been on elsewhere too, if you've been in the
I have no
Philippines,
idea.
right?
Well, it's great to meet you.
Great to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you.